The canyon had a voice, if you stood still long enough to hear it. Amy Whitaker stood at the rim just before sunrise. Boots planted firmly in the red dust, the wind tugging at the loose strands of her dark hair. Below her, the river curved through stone, carved by centuries of patience. The cliffs glowed amber as dawn began to spill over the horizon. This land was not just property, it was memory. Her grandfather had settled here with little more than a wagon, a stubborn will, and a belief that land should be respected, not conquered. Her mother had scattered wildflower seeds along the upper ridge every spring. Amy had grown up chasing echoes through narrow rock corridors, learning which winds meant rain and which meant dust. And now, men in polished boots wanted to turn it into a luxury resort. She unfolded the letter again, though she had memorized every word. Western Horizon Development formally requests acquisition of the Whitaker Canyon property. Acquisition. The word felt like theft, dressed in fine clothing. The crunch of horse hooves against gravel interrupted the quiet. Amy did not turn immediately. She already knew who it would be. George Callahan dismounted several yards behind her, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy. He was not dressed like a typical city agent. His coat carried trail dust, and his boots were worn at the heel. But the leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm marked him clearly enough. "Miss Whitaker," he said evenly. "Mr. Callahan." Her voice carried no warmth, but no fear either. He stepped closer to the rim, careful with his footing. When he finally looked out over the canyon, his expression shifted despite himself. "It's impressive," he admitted quietly. "It isn't for sale." He inhaled slowly, as though choosing his next words with care. "The offer is more than fair. The company plans minimal structural impact, eco-lodges, scenic walkways, employment for neighboring towns, and roads carved through sacred stone," she replied. "Blasting, fencing crowds." George didn't argue immediately. That unsettled her more than persuasion would have. Instead, he asked, "Why does this particular land matter so much to you?" Amy finally turned to face him fully. His eyes were steady, not cold, not mocking, curious. "My mother's ashes are scattered near the river bend," she said. "My father proposed to her on that cliff ledge. Every season of my life is written into this canyon. You can't replace that with board." For a moment, the only sound between them was wind sliding along the stone walls. "I didn't know," George said. "Most of you don't bother to—" He flinched slightly at the word you. "I'm not here to disrespect you," he said, "but I have investors expecting progress, and I have a promise to keep." Silence stretched again, but it felt different now, less like confrontation and more like weight settling into place. George looked out over the canyon once more, longer this time. The sunlight had reached the lower cliffs, setting them ablaze in gold and copper. A hawk circled below, its shadow gliding across rock like a warning. "If you refuse," he said carefully, "the company may pursue legal routes." Amy lifted her chin. "Then they'll learn this land fights back." He almost smiled at that, though he quickly hid it. "I'd like to come back tomorrow," he said. "Not with contracts, just to talk." She studied him. He did not carry the sharp arrogance she had expected. There was something restrained, in him conflict perhaps. "You can come," she said at last. "But don't mistake conversation for negotiation." He nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked back to his horse. Amy watched him ride away until the dust swallowed his outline. She had faced drought, wildfire, and loneliness on this land. She could face developers too. Still, as the sun climbed higher and light poured fully into the canyon, she felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath her resolve. This fight would not be simple, and neither, she suspected, was George Callahan. George returned the next morning without a portfolio. Amy noticed that first. He rode in at a steady pace, dust trailing behind his horse, but there were no rolled maps strapped to the saddle and no survey stakes tied along the side. Just a canteen, a bedroll, and the same quiet look in his eyes. "You're lighter today," Amy called from where she was hauling water from the well. "Figured I'd try listening instead of measuring," he replied. She studied him carefully, before nodding toward the second bucket. Well, doesn't care who you work for. He stepped in, without hesitation. Work came first. They repaired a loose shutter on the homestead and reinforced part of the corral fence weakened by winter winds. George worked without complaint, though it was clear manual labor was not his usual duty anymore. You grew up ranching, she asked. Farming, he said. Kansas plains, until the railroad rerouted water access. Land dried, we lost it. Amy paused slightly. And development fixed that. It brought industry jobs, roads. He drove a nail clean through wood. It saved my town, but not your farm. He didn't answer. By midday, the sun bore down hot and merciless. Amy led him toward a narrow trail descending partway into the canyon. The path was steep and uneven, forcing careful footing. Why show me this? He asked. Because, if you're going to argue for building here, you should understand what you're standing on. They reached a natural overlook where the stone walls curved inward, like an amphitheater. Etched into the rock were faded petroglyph spirals, animals, human figures. George stepped closer, almost reverently. Older than my grandfather. Maybe older than this country. The weight of it settled between them. This isn't empty land, Amy said quietly. It holds history you can't rebuild once it's gone. George crouched, tracing the air just above one carved line without touching it. The company didn't mention this. They don't look past profit margins. A long silence followed. When they climbed back up, they found two riders waiting near the homestead men in pressed coats, one holding a leather case. George's jaw tightened. They weren't supposed to come yet. One of the men dismounted briskly. Miss Whitaker, we're here to conduct a preliminary survey. You don't have permission, Amy said firmly. The man glanced at George. We were told cooperation was possible. It isn't, Amy replied. George stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between the surveyor and the canyon trail. She's within her rights, he said evenly. No survey without written consent. The surveyor frowned. Head office won't be pleased. That's not her concern. Amy caught the shift in tone. It wasn't professional detachment anymore. It sounded like defense. The men exchanged glances before remounting. This will escalate, one warned before riding off. Dust hung in the air long after they disappeared. You didn't have to do that, Amy said. Yes, I did. She searched his face. You're risking your position. He exhaled slowly. Maybe my position needs risking. The honesty in his voice unsettled her, more than confrontation would have. That evening, they sat near the canyon rim, as twilight softened the stone walls into deep violet shadows. The river below shimmered faintly under fading light. My supervisor will push for legal leverage, George admitted. Boundary disputes, access claims. My family's deeds go back generations, Amy replied. I've kept every record. He looked at her carefully. Then you're going to need more than stubbornness. You'll need strategy. A faint smile tugged at her lips. You offering to help. I don't know what I'm offering yet. The wind rose, carrying cool air from the depths of the canyon. Amy wrapped her arms loosely against it. Why are you really here, George? She asked quietly. He stared out over the cliffs. Because for the first time in years, I'm not sure progress means what I thought it did. The canyon seemed to breathe around them, ancient and unmoving, somewhere between property lines and promises. A crack had formed not in the land, but in George's certainty, and Amy could feel it widening. The escalation came faster than either of them expected. 3 days after the surveyor's failed visit, a formal notice arrived, creased, stamped, and heavy with threat. Western Horizon Development claimed partial access through a disputed boundary dating back to a territorial land registry error. If proven valid, it would allow them to begin preliminary work along the canyon's northern ridge. Amy read the notice twice before handing it to George. They're reaching, she said calmly, though her jaw was tight. They are, George admitted. But they've got lawyers who specialize in reaching. They stood inside the small homestead kitchen, sunlight slanting through the window and catching the dust in the air. The place smelled of coffee and cedarwood. It didn't look like land that belonged in a courtroom. My grandfather surveyed this property himself, Amy said. He rode every boundary marker. George leaned over the worn wooden table. Hand-drawn surveys don't always stand against corporate filings. Her eyes flashed. So, what are you saying? That they can erase 100 years because someone in an office says so? No, he said gently. I'm saying we need proof that stands stronger than sentiment. The word hung between them. Sentiment. Amy turned away, steadying herself against the counter. This land isn't sentiment. I know, he replied quietly. But judges don't rule on heart. That afternoon, they rode together to the county records office, 2 towns over. It was a squat brick building with faded paint and overworked clerks who barely glanced up from their paperwork. They spent hours combing through old ledgers. Amy's fingers traced her grandfather's name in ink that had bled slightly with age. George cross-referenced maps, noting inconsistencies in the company's claim. Here, he said finally, tapping a margin note in a 40-year-old registry. The boundary adjustment they're referencing was voided due to improper filing. Amy leaned closer. So they're building a case on something that was already dismissed. Looks that way. For the first time since the notice arrived, she allowed herself to breathe fully. On the ride back, storm clouds gathered over the canyon. The sky darkened, heavy and restless. "Why are you helping me?" she asked over the wind. He didn't answer immediately. "Because I've seen what happens when corporations decide land is just an asset. My family lost everything because someone else decided what was efficient. And now you work for them." Yes. His voice was honest, unguarded. "And maybe I've been telling myself it's different when it isn't." Thunder cracked across the horizon. They reached the canyon rim just as rain began to fall sharp. Sudden drops that darkened the red soil almost instantly. The storm rolled in fast, wind whipping across the cliffs. Amy dismounted carefully, but her boot slipped on wet gravel near the edge. The ground shifted beneath her. Before she could fall, George caught her arm and pulled her back hard against him. For a split second, they were suspended, her breath caught, his hand firm around her waist, rain streaking down between them. "You need to be careful," he murmured. "I usually am." He didn't release her immediately. The storm raged around them, thunder echoing through the canyon like distant artillery. His grip softened, but didn't disappear. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said quietly. She searched his face, rain clinging to his lashes. "Are you sure you're ready to stand against your own company?" He hesitated, but only briefly. "I'm sure I'm tired of standing for the wrong thing." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the canyon in stark white for a heartbeat. When he finally stepped back, the air between them felt change-charged in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. That night, as rain washed the dust from stone, George sat on the porch steps of the homestead. Amy joined him, handing him a dry blanket. "They'll push harder now," she said. "I know. Legal threats. Pressure, maybe political influence." "I know," he repeated. She studied him in the dim lantern light. "You could still walk away." He shook his head. "No, I don't think I can." The canyon below shimmered in the after-storm silence, clean and fierce. For years, George had believed progress meant building over what came before. But here, standing beside Amy, he was beginning to understand something else. Some things weren't meant to be conquered. Some things were meant to be protected. And somewhere between boundary lines and thunder, his loyalty had shifted completely. Western Horizon moved quickly. Within a week, formal legal documents were filed with the county court, claiming partial access rights through what they called a corrected territorial boundary interpretation. It sounded official, enough to confuse anyone unfamiliar with land law. Amy wasn't confused. She was furious. "They're twisting a clerical error into ownership," she said, pacing inside the homestead while George reviewed the filing again. "They're hoping intimidation will make you settle," George replied. "Most landowners do." "I'm not most landowners." He looked up at her. "No, you're not." 2 days later, 3 black carriages rolled up the dirt road toward the canyon. This time they didn't bother pretending it was informal. A survey crew stepped out, along with a deputy sheriff and George's direct supervisor, Mr. Halbrook. Falbrook adjusted his gloves, as if the dust offended him. Miss Whitaker, we are operating under pending legal review. We are authorized to begin preliminary marking. You are not authorized to step 1 inch past my fence, Amy said evenly. The deputy shifted awkwardly, but remained silent. Halbrook's gaze shifted to George Callahan. I assume you've explained the situation. I have, George replied. T and I disagree with the company's interpretation. The silence that followed was sharp. Halbrook removed his hat slowly. You're employed by Western Horizon. For the moment, Amy didn't speak, but she felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she knew. You'll regret this, Halbrook warned. This project has state-level support. Then, we'll see how state-level support handles voided boundary claims and cultural preservation violations, George said calmly. Halbrook's eyes narrowed. You've chosen a side. Yes, George answered. The survey crew hesitated. Without George's endorsement, their footing felt less certain. After a tense exchange and no clear legal enforcement order, they withdrew for now. But the message was clear. This was no longer negotiation. It was war. Word spread quickly through nearby towns. Ranchers who had known Amy's family for years began riding out to stand visible along the canyon road. A local historian came forward with documentation proving the petroglyphs were registered as protected cultural artifacts. Environmental advocates offered to testify in court. Amy hadn't asked for a movement, but one had formed around her. The court hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. The small county courtroom overflowed with onlookers the morning of the trial. George sat beside Amy, no longer wearing the insignia vest of Western Horizon. He looked different, without it less like an agent, more like himself. Halbrook represented the company with polished confidence. Their lawyers argued technical boundaries and economic opportunity. Jobs, tourism, infrastructure. When it was Amy's turn, she stood with quiet steadiness. This land has been privately owned and responsibly maintained for generations, she said. It contains registered cultural artifacts and burial grounds. Development would irreparably damage both. George testified next. Gasps rippled through the room when he took the stand against his former employer. The boundary interpretation Western Horizon is relying on was voided decades ago due to improper filing, he stated clearly. Proceeding would not only be unethical, it would be unlawful. Halbrook's jaw tightened, but the damage was done. Hours later, the judge returned with a decision. The company's claim was invalid. No development could proceed without explicit consent from Amy Whitaker. The canyon remained protected under private ownership and cultural preservation statutes. A wave of relief moved through the courtroom. Outside, sunlight bathed the courthouse steps. Neighbors clapped Amy on the shoulder. Supporters shook George's hand. You didn't have to do that, Amy said softly. Once the crowd thinned. Yes, he replied. I did. You lost your job. He looked at her, calm and certain. I found something better. The canyon waited for them when they rode back that evening and changed eternal, untouched. But something between them had changed completely. They stood at the rim as the sun began to sink, casting the cliffs in molten gold. You chose the canyon, she said quietly. George shook his head. No, I chose what was right. The wind moved between them, softer now. The fight had been won, but the future was just beginning. Spring returned gently to the canyon, as if even the seasons respected what had been protected. Wildflowers bloomed along the upper ridges, where Amy's mother once scattered seeds. The river ran strong from winter melt, cutting silver through the red stone. Hawks circled high above, undisturbed. The legal battle was over. Western Horizon withdrew completely after the court ruling. Unwilling to risk further public scrutiny, investors shifted elsewhere. The threat that once loomed heavy over the canyon dissolved like dust in wind. But Amy knew protection required more than a courtroom victory. It required presence and purpose. You ever think about what comes next? George asked one morning as they stood overlooking the northern ridge. All the time, she replied. Winning isn't the same as preserving. He nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. Without corporate backing, George had little savings and no position to fall back on. Yet he had never felt more certain about his direction. What if, he began carefully, we allow people to see it, just not own it? Amy turned toward him. Small guided groups, he continued. Limited access. Education about the land, its history, its cultural markings. Strict pathways. No construction. No blasting. Preservation through understanding, she said slowly. Exactly. Amy looked out over the canyon again. For generations, her family had protected it through isolation. But maybe the future required something different. Guardianship through awareness. If people understand why it matters, she said, they're less likely to destroy it. That was how the Canyon Stewardship Program began. It wasn't flashy. No grand openings. No ribbon cuttings. Just carefully planned walking trails, marked by natural stone. Small educational plaques placed at a respectful distance from petroglyphs. And scheduled visits limited to a handful of guests at a time. Amy led the tours herself at first. She told stories of her grandfather riding the boundary at dawn. She spoke of the native carvings etched into stone and the wildlife that nested along the cliffs. She shared how her mother's ashes rested near the river bend, asking visitors for quiet reflection when they reached that place. And they listened. George handled logistics, permits, scheduling, ensuring strict conservation practices were upheld. He worked harder than he ever had under Western Horizon, but the work felt different, honest. One evening, after the last visitors departed, Amy found him near the river bend. The sky burned orange and crimson above them. The canyon walls reflected the light like fire. You came here to buy this land, she said softly. I did. And now, he stepped closer. Now I'm grateful you refused. The wind moved gently between them. No longer harsh, no longer warning. I thought protecting this place meant fighting alone, she admitted. You don't have to anymore. He reached for her hand carefully, giving her time to pull away if she wished. She didn't. The canyon had tested them both. Her resolve, his conscience. It had forced them to confront who they were when profit and principle collided. And in the end, it gave them something neither expected. Partnership, purpose, love, rooted as deeply as the canyon walls themselves. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Amy leaned lightly against him. This land was never meant to be claimed, she murmured. Only cared for. George smiled. Then I suppose we're its caretakers now. Below them, the river continued its endless journey, unchanged by contracts or courtrooms. The canyon remained sacred, protected, alive, and Amy Whitaker no longer stood alone at its rim. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Western stories.